So hello everyone, thanks so much, so many of you for coming. So there's 55 people on this call and I know there's a lot of expertise, uh, including the honorary Macedonian consul to Arizona. Jason Miko is on the call, also Kirill Christovsky, one of our faculty colleagues here at ASU, and also um, Dan Fellner, another colleague who spent some time last year in Macedonia as a Fulbright Fellow, and also Henry Sivak and Daniel Pout, my colleagues in the School of Politics and Global Studies, who led a study abroad to Macedonia, both Greece and the Republic last summer. So besides all our Peace Corps veterans, our Title VIII students, and our board members and friends of the center, there's really a lot of expertise here. So I will try and complement what Danny just shared with us. So I'm currently working on a project looking at the late 80s and 1990s political discourse in the Republic, what was then the Republic of Macedonia, so part of Yugoslavia. And that's, of course, the time at which, as Danny pointed out, the Macedonian question, the Macedonian conflict, which for many people had ended or had gone into some kind of hibernation in the Yugoslav period, that is the post-World War II Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which authorized and recognized a Macedonian nationality. That sort of 40-year period, in some sense, did some of the work that the Prespa Agreement, in my view, sort of tries to restore, which is trying to, it had the effect of allowing Macedonians inside federal Yugoslavia to have a passport with which they could travel broadly because they were Yugoslav citizens. But within the Republic and within Yugoslavia, they were able to embrace and pronounce themselves Macedonian in a way that, with that sort of added weight, if you like, of Yugoslavia, allowed them to cross the Greek border. The picture you have on this first screen is from protests in 1990, which according to Tanyug, there were 50,000 people protesting at this point, and they closed down the Yugoslav-Greek border at Gergelia, which is on the main train route up from Greece through Yugoslavia to Western Europe, as well as the road route. And the reason for this was a kind of series of reanimations of questions around Macedonian identity and Macedonian status, which had really focused around that really was a legacy of the Greek Civil War, which followed World War II. And at the end of the Greek Civil War, a lot of the population of northern Greece who identified as Macedonian fled Greece after the defeat of the communist side in the Greek Civil War, and often left family members behind, the folks that Danny referred to, who are the Macedonian-speaking minorities in northern Greece, and also settled both in Eastern Europe and also in Canada and Australia, the communities where Danny did work. And so you've got this sort of scar of the World War II and this bitter communist fascist struggle still sort of lingering through the Cold War. And it really comes back into prominence in the 1980s when Greece, the Republic of Greece settles, sort of finally passes in Parliament a kind of reconciliation act which allows former communist fighters to return and claim their property in northern Greece. But it specifically says you only get to do that if you identify as Greek. And so anyone who spoke Macedonian, felt Macedonian, was sort of oriented towards Macedonian culture, was prohibited from that return. So that was sort of one flashpoint in the 1980s, and it impacted this global community. So not just in Eastern Europe, but as I said, also in Australia and Canada. And then it was followed by a series of other shifts in Greek policy towards, as it were, positioning the country to respond if and when Yugoslavia broke apart. So there were issues around people being allowed visas to get to Greece. There were issues around the recognition of diplomas issued in Skopje. And so this protest in 1990 was one response to that. So as I said, there's a level of spontaneity, but you don't get 50,000 people in a demonstration without some kind of organization behind it. So I just want to cover some of what was happening in the 1980s leading up to Prespers. So David, can you go to the next slide? And I can't see the whole slide. That's me, isn't it? If you go to view options, you should be able to see the whole thing. So this is we haven't had a map yet. This is just a map which I hope avoids the charge of that was thrown at Macedonians who produced maps of where Macedonians lived or where Macedonian was spoken historically. That is, when people reproduced maps in the 1990s, which showed the last sort of slice of the Ottoman Empire in continental Europe, which is roughly what you see here. These shaded areas here. This is a map of where different Macedonian dialects are spoken, but it also shows you the rough extent of what people are talking about when they talk about Macedonia writ large, or geographical Macedonia. It extends beyond the current republic. It extends into Greece. It extends also into Bulgaria. This is the sort of legacy of the 1912, 1913 Balkan Wars, where the black lines that you see here, the lines between modern states, actually came into being, authorized by the great powers at the Treaty of Bucharest. And again, there's a resonance to that Bucharest location as where the Balkan Wars were settled and where these lines came into existence. So 50% of this territory of Macedonia, if you accept the argument that we can refer to an area that was part of the Ottoman Empire, split differently administratively, but if we call that area Macedonia, then 50% of it is actually in modern Greece, which is worth recalling in terms of understanding where the Greek nervousness about what it would mean to embrace a notion of Macedonia, what it would mean to think about cultural ties between different parts of Macedonia. I've pointed to two places here. One of the suggestions I had to Danny was to sort of think about these figures from the past, as he mentioned. So Alexander the Great being the great one, who was actually born, as you can see by this bottom arrow, was born in Pella, which is in what on the map is referred to as Greek Macedonia, part of the modern nation state of Greece. That arrow is a little bit off. It's a little bit closer to Thessaloniki, but you get the idea. And then the second arrow points to where Goce Delchev, who was the spiritual leader of the Macedonian uprising in 1903, which is sort of pointed to by many Macedonians and historians outside Macedonia as a kind of touchstone of when we can definitively say something's going on here that can't be reduced to someone else's national identity. When you have 20,000 people taking up arms in the name of Macedonia to found a republic in the mountain town of Kruševo and to bring an end to imperial rule of this region. And that uprising in 1903, Goce Delchev died before the actual uprising, but he was trained as a Bulgarian military officer, is claimed today in Bulgaria as a Bulgarian national hero. But as you can tell from the location where he died, the Ilinden uprising of 1903 didn't really respect or fall strictly between any modern national boundaries. It was especially centered around the towns of Prilep, Bitola, and Florin and Lerin in Greek Macedonia. So it really sort of, it was basically on the west of the territory that you're seeing here. we see the next slide, please, David? So that's a sort of piece of history that is worth recalling. This idea that in its 19th and 20th century forms, this ideal of Macedonian autonomy from an empire is still a kind of linking force for when Macedonians think about the territories on which Macedonian is historically spoken and which united this movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's also worth remembering that through until 1941 and the end of royalist Yugoslavia, if you were a Macedonian national activist, your chief enemy at that point was actually the Serbian-led Yugoslavia, because that was where the repression on identifying as Macedonian was actually the strongest. It was strong also in northern Greece, but it was in the heartland around Prilep, Bitola, where the Ilinden uprising had been strongest, was where those advocates of some kind of Macedonian autonomy found themselves most violently confronted by the Serbian authorities. And one of the arguments that's made about the particular ferocity of that confrontation is because the Serbian police and Serbian informers could more easily penetrate those communities than either the Ottoman Empire had been able to do, or in some cases separated by a language, Greek authorities were able to do. It was harder to sort of carve out a space where the state couldn't penetrate and break down the organizations. So that's worth remembering about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, because that legacy of hostility to Serbia carried over after World War II and was another part of the history of Macedonian identity that got suppressed during the Yugoslav period, and then sort of came out within the Republic in the 1980s, when there was a kind of flourishing of enthusiasm for pluralist history, for opening new doors in history that young intellectuals and some dissidents felt had been shut down by the ideal of Yugoslav unity after World War II. So a lot of Macedonians and Macedonian autonomists and people who pursued an idea of a fully autonomous Macedonia ended up jailed by the Yugoslav authorities after World War II. And so it wasn't a sort of straightforward ally for Macedonians, especially as Yugoslavia came apart. And especially when Slovenia and Croatia left Yugoslavia, it really raised fears among Macedonian leaders and citizens that they were heading towards a new Serbian domination, which within socialist Yugoslavia had not been the case. And they felt that especially because Yugoslav-Greek foreign relations were led out of Belgrade. And so as Macedonian intellectuals and historians and citizens sort of started asking questions about what is Macedonian identity, how deep does it go, what is this long-time relationship that we have with parts of northern Greece, it got shut down or from Belgrade in the name of international relations. So there's a real sort of sense of victimization grew at this time. But then in the 80s, you see a sort of breaking with a lot of these taboos about what the future of Macedonia is going to look like. So I've listed some of the sort of flashpoints that occurred in the 1980s. The World Meeting of Child Refugees, a World Meeting of Child Refugees took place in the Republic of Macedonia in 1988. This is still in the Yugoslav period. And this is those diaspora Macedonians cut off from their birthplaces in northern Greece, holding a rally and linking their plight to the larger movement across Europe about minority rights and human rights. We saw the protests at the Greek-Yugoslav border I already mentioned, and you saw new parties forming as within Yugoslavia we moved to a multi-party system for the first elections in 1990. There are political leaders whose key platform is some kind of recognition of the unity of Macedonia, some kind of acknowledgement of historical injustice, including Vumero Diplomaner, which won the largest number of seats in that first parliament, in that first election in 1990, was unable to form a government because of the perceived friction, or because of the friction that they encouraged with the large Albanian population within the Republic of Macedonia. So in some sense, the Vumero Diplomaner and its leader, its initial leader, Ljupčo Gordievski, got caught in this zero-sum thinking, whereby if you're advocating for the recognition of Macedonia and an acknowledgement of minority rights for Macedonians in Bulgaria and in Greece, there must be some anti-Albanian component to what you're doing. It wasn't clear that that was a central part of his philosophy. It certainly was part of what drew at least some voters anxious about the growing Albanian solidarity within the Republic of Macedonia, and a concern of, once Macedonia was autonomous, what Macedonian Albanian relations would look like. That was clearly part of the appeal for some voters, but not the whole story. Next slide, please. So one of the political figures of the 1980s and 1990s who I'm really fascinated by is Vasil Tupokovsky, who was among the most popular politicians in Macedonia in the 1980s. He was the Macedonian representative on the Yugoslav presidency, and if you he was very much in the foreground in 1991 as a member of the Yugoslav presidency who was trying to damp down the increasing armed violence in both Croatia and Slovenia. So he was sort of called in as the delegate to try and resolve these things. He was also at that Greek Yugoslav border protest in 1990, speaking to that crowd. And he personally is from one of these families that settled in the Republic from northern Greece. So there's a sort of personal history to this, which then sort of gets transformed into his embrace of this. He's sort of the pioneer of this move to tie back to Alexander the Great. So Danny sort of referred to that as extreme Macedonian nationalism. It's a kind of deeply romantic nationalism, very much modeled after the Greek template of how you do nationalism. You go as ancient as you can, and you sort of, if you run into someone else's bones along the way, you dig deeper, or you dig around, or you make an argument that what you're finding in the ground is actually yours. And what the way he sort of stamped this in broader discussions in the Republic is by publishing a children's book, Stories from Ancient Macedonia, which I've reproduced a sort of map from here. I came across it in a rented flat in Skopje last year. 2 years ago, I hadn't seen it before. It's kind of fascinating. If you get a chance to zoom in on this map, you see that it marks Macedonia up in the north, and then it names a number of neighbors, including Greeks, Illyrians, I think there are some Thracians, and it obviously erases the modern political borders, because why would you put modern political borders on a children's map depicting the ancient world? But what's interesting about the way that Tupokovsky writes this narrative is he writes it in the name of a cavalry officer working serving with Alexander the Great, and so the language is of I and we, sort of projected down the centuries. And it's a kind of blurring of the authorial voice, who claims a we community with Alexander and Philip, and the imagined narrator of the book. So it's a really kind of interesting exercise in common sense nationalism. We are Macedonians. Alexander the Great was Macedonian. We're in the same territory, more or less. Tell me why we're not related. That's kind of the mode of it. And it's, it's a little bit like British style embrace of, I don't know, King Harold or King William, or, who fought each other, right? But they're somehow incorporated into our national imagination as citizens of modern Britain. Next slide, please. So we talked briefly about the Prespa Agreement, and I was a big fan of the Prespa Agreement before it got signed. So we'll send around a couple of links to pieces I wrote in ASU now, sort of saying like this, it's about time, let's just get this signed. Because as Danny said, the Republic of Macedonia, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, got frozen out of a lot of international organizations by either the fear of a Greek veto, or in 2008 in Bucharest, the first time Macedonia was scheduled to join NATO, by a direct use of the Greek veto. And again, I find it sort of striking that this happened in Bucharest in 2008, Bucharest being the site where the borders carving up this territory and splitting a community who shared the same language, who shared certain political ideals expressed through the Northern Uprising of 1903. That community was split into three by the Treaty of Bucharest in 1913. And so the fact that trying to join NATO in 2008, it's Bucharest where Macedonia gets slapped down, really fueled the kind of stubborn and there's a Macedonian word like inayet, which is like spite, or like, well, okay, you're going to do that, we're going to be as bloody-minded as you are. And it really sort of served the interests of the more nationalistic Vomero-Dupămânea movement led by Nicola Gruevski that actually stayed in power in Macedonia from 2006 up until 2016. And it's only when that regime finally gets defeated in an election again, by Albanian voters both crossing over to vote for the Social Democrats, who are the leading opposition to Vomero, and also by Albanian political parties deciding they are not going to form any more coalitions with this group of politicians who have wrapped themselves in the flag, but are actually deeply criminal in terms of the way they run the country between 2006 and 2016. It's only at that moment that the Prespa Agreement becomes possible again. The Prespa Agreement, as Danny said, is signed, but it's far from over. So I just sort of flagged some of the issues that have arisen. One is that it's very much opposed. It's as the pathway, as a sort of precondition for Macedonia to be incorporated into European security and economic structures. And Macedonia has already now joined NATO since Prespa. It's very much seen as running against Russian foreign policy interests, insofar as the Balkans is still part of the near abroad as conceived by President Putin. Oh, Irina's called me on time. There's a real reluctance, there's a real hesitation by Russia to embrace this, and so you see Russia publicly indicating in both Greek and Macedonian media that they see the Prespa Agreement as somehow violating the true interests of people in both countries. We see the Bulgarian, we now seeing a lot of discussion of Bulgarian, not necessarily official historians, but Bulgarian, in Bulgaria, there's a discourse around reigniting the idea that Macedonian history is with Alexander off the table, then the space for Macedonian history again focuses on that 19th, 20th century period, which is a period where Bulgarian national history also likes to claim a number of leading figures as their heroes. So I've put here a picture of Goce Delchev, as I mentioned, died in northern Greece, was born in northern Greece, and is claimed as a Bulgarian, a key figure in Bulgarian revolutionary history, and also as a kind of founding father of Macedonian the Macedonian national movement. And then the last thing, David, last slide. The last thing is just that the diaspora, especially those with ties to northern Greece, remain deeply skeptical about the Prespa Agreement. One of the other provisions that I find striking, as Danny noted, the language of citizenship and nationality. The language that I find interesting and hard to know how to deal with it is the language about the use of toponyms. So villages and territories in northern Greece, the agreement sort of insists and makes criminal anyone using toponyms that aren't those authorized by the Greek state. And it just makes, it's very complicated for me if you're trying to write, for me personally, you're trying to write the history of a migrant from a village in northern Greece with a Macedonian name who thinks of that as the name of their village. But now the Prespa Agreement puts someone on the hook legally if you use a term other than the modern Greek toponym for that. So I mean, there are wrinkles that can be sorted out. What's more problematic is how it's divided opinion still in the Republic of Macedonia. So even though the Social Democratic Party embraced it and passed it, they did so without the kind of resounding endorsement by a referendum that they would have liked. And so you can see in this map how in a subsequent presidential election in April 2019, you can see how the country is still very evenly split between supporting Vumero Diplomané, with their candidate getting 45% of the vote, and SDSM getting 51% of the vote. Obviously less closely contested than in the US, but some of the same intense political polarization that we see in the US also very much present in Macedonia and centered around the Prespa Agreement, which if a Vumero government came back into power, we can see them not really abiding by that agreement potentially, and that leading to further issues for Macedonia in the international frame. So I went on too long. I apologize, Irina. I'm heading out. So that's what I have. Irina, thank you. Apologies.
So it was my mistake to think that a topic this interesting and with this much kind of both kind of the central story and all of the stories that contribute to the story could be covered in just a short half hour. I see that most of you are still here, so your patience for it hasn't run out. And I do have some questions for our presenters in the chat that I would love to pose on behalf of the people who asked them. So thank you so much, Keith, and thank you, Dr. Danforth, as well. I don't know what to call everybody. So this question is from Eric Rodriguez, and he was asking about elections in North Macedonia, specifically VMRO, who were vowing to reverse the Prespa Agreement and were running on this issue. The consensus amongst Eric's colleagues is that if VMRO would likely not be able to achieve this, and he was wondering what people think of their chances. Can you also, I don't know what it means, so VMRO, I'm guessing is the name of a party, but what does that stand for the rest of us?
Danny, shall I go? Do you want to go?
Or Keith.
So thanks, Eric. So VMRO is Macedonia for Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, which was the historical name of the organization back in the late 19th, early 20th century, and was adopted by one of the new parties in the 1990s, along with the longer name, also the Democratic Party of Macedonian National Unity. So that's Vumero. Yeah, I touched on this. I mean, as Eric said, yes, they're running, they're pulling in votes by saying this is a violation of all that's sacred about, there's all kinds of ways in which, in their view, the Prespa Agreement, Social Democrats kind of gave away the store in the Prespa Agreement. That's a reading that ignores the political cost that the Greek side also paid for signing the Prespa agreement, where the government that signed it has actually fallen. So it's kind of it's a kind of emphasis on our own victimization versus actually the realistic compromise that had to be made. But yeah, I think that if VMRO were to win the next elections, which were scheduled for April, and when they were running neck and neck, and now has been delayed until later this year. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they will, I don't know enough about constitutional law in the Republic of Macedonia to know if they can reverse it. I do know that they will probably approach it in the way that the US Republican Party approached the Affordable Care Act, in the sense that they will do everything they can to undermine it, disrespect it, while not wanting to lose the NATO membership that came about as a result, and not necessarily. I mean, there's a whole lot of questions here. It's not clear whether VMRO Diplomatia has actually radically reorganized as a party, because its business practices and its the ways in which it was gathering power and influence and resources by leveraging the particular position that it had, are the kind of, it was relying on the kind of financial practices that are easier to do without European scrutiny and without meeting the conditions for European membership. So there's a degree to which old VMRO was quite invested in not being part of a larger international community, but being able to say that it wasn't their fault that they weren't. And insofar as the Prespa agreement took away the idea that Greece was the one that was blocking it, whether VMRO will actually own refusing to be part of those systems is not clear. But one way or the other, they'll face a reckoning from voters if they renege on that deal.
Dr. Danforth, any additional thoughts on that one?
I mean, I am not competent to speculate on outcomes of elections, but I just want to reiterate something that Keith mentioned, that the Prespa agreement is not the end of the Macedonian question. When it came out, there were several articles that said, at last, the end, and it's not going to be the end. I think that Tsipras and Zaev both took risks, and I would admire them for taking difficult stands that were bound to be unpopular and were unpopular in their countries, but it seemed to me to be a step in the right direction.
Thank you. So this question is from Mark Daniels. What lessons does the North Macedonian Greek resolution allowing the ascension to NATO and the EU, what can it offer us for the current situation between Kosovo and Serbia? Who wants to get in on that?
I'll let Keith take that one too.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those points where the Russian foreign ministry, they're onto something, in the sense that it was achieved by extensive international engagement with both leaders, and with two leaders who were willing to run the risk of alienating the sort of more entrenched nationalism on both sides. The Kosovo-Serbia discussion is it's newer, and it's also, when I say it's newer, what I mean is the violence is more recent. The position, the sort of quasi-legal position that the Serbian government or Serbian nationalists can still cling to, which is no one ever acknowledged this was actually a separate country, and before it was a separate country, it was part of our country. That's actually a different structural configuration than the debate between the situation between Macedonia and Greece. And the other thing is, Macedonians and Greeks individually, so Danny sort of pointed to the kind of rhetoric and intensity that some people express, but you sort of drill down to the one-on-one interpersonal relations, and there's a lot of commerce going on, and there's a lot of tourism going on, and there's a lot of socialization going on between Greeks and Macedonians now, which is much less the case between Kosovo Albanians and Serbs. So I think if insofar as it shows that seemingly intractable issues can be resolved with the application of common interests by Europe and the US assisting as well, then there's a lesson there. But I think the lift is much harder in the Kosovo case.
Thank you. Any thoughts, Dr. Danforth?
Not about that issue in particular, no, but if I could take a quick opportunity to mention the issue of toponyms, which Keith raised. I agree with him completely that it's a real challenge as a scholar to deal with the issues. So if I'm writing about Florina, I feel obligated to say Florina because that's the Greek name and the city's in Greece. But if I'm writing about people who know the place as Ledin, then I, as Keith did on his map, put Ledin in parentheses after Florina, or say the city of Florina, which Macedonians refer to as Ledin. And just to give my good friend Keith a little hard time, I noticed you put the Macedonian names in parentheses after the Greek names, but you didn't put the Greek name Monastir in parentheses after Bitola. So that's the kind of detail that would lead you to be crucified by social media in the intense nationalist environment.
I have to be careful of people I borrow maps from. Thank
Yes.
you.
Good.
In their agendas. Okay, so there's just one more question in the chat. And of course, we would love to continue this discussion indefinitely, but for now, we'll just take this one more question. Again, be grateful to all of you for your attention here. So this question is from Sarah Rondeau. Can you briefly discuss Greek-Macedonian relations and coordination? Oh, I just realized there was another one, so I'll ask both at once, and you can respond to whichever ones you feel most called upon to respond to. One was about the Bulgarian stance on the naming controversy, and the other one that was from Jacob Lassen, and the other question was, can you briefly discuss Greek-Macedonian relations and coordination in the Balkan migration crisis context? I'm assuming this means the kind of inflow of refugees from other parts of the world, the Middle East, North Africa, etc.
Go for it, Keith.
Okay, so yeah, the Bulgarian position is, as I said, the sort of spaces of the way that the sort of historical space has been carved out. I mean, one way to think about it is, okay, Greece got formed first as a nation state with international assistance in the early 19th century, and quickly sort of formed this model of national history, which included ancient, Byzantine, and modern. And that's just the way that it's done. And then the assumption that there are invisible strands linking across these three, which is how you get from modern Athens to ancient Athens, which, as Danny pointed out, for the Macedonians, it's largely insofar as it's genetic, it's okay, but it ignores the sort of pathways that have happened along the way. Like, I was very disappointed when I found out that at one point the Parthenon was used as an Ottoman magazine and was blown up completely. And so what we see now was reconstructed in the 19th century. It's very sad when you realize that this imagined continuity is actually prefabricated for you by someone else. Since then, the Bulgaria got sort of formed as a state and as it were, was the sort of first arrival on the scene of the 19th century, early 20th century, anti-Ottoman, South Slavic movements. And also they were the sort of first arrival on claiming the legacy of, well, what was the language that when the Slav missionaries came and brought Christianity to this part of the world, whose were they? Which language is that? So Bulgaria sort of arrived first on those two scenes. So the space for Macedonia that's left behind, or modern Macedonia that's left behind, is limited. I don't think Bulgaria ever really had much of a stake on the Alexander side or the ancient side. And in some sense, that the resolution of that and the sort of has brought attention back to this conflict that ran throughout the Yugoslav period between Bulgarian and Macedonian historians about what was what, right? So that goes back at least to the 1940s and has now sort of been reactivated by the apparent move to deal with the Greek Macedonian side. There was a kind of commission also formed between Bulgarian and Macedonian histories to try and figure stuff out, just as there is, as part of the Prespa Agreement, there's a commission of Greek and Macedonian historians trying to work out how to implement the agreement and continue scholarly work. But the Bulgarian group has worked, I think the relations broke down more quickly than they did in the Macedonian Greek case. And then as far as the refugee movement, it's in 2015, my sense was, I mean, at the time, President Ivanov in the Republic of Macedonia publicly took a stance which was somewhat reminiscent of Viktor Orban's stance in Hungary. In other words, a sort of, why are we the people whose obligation it is to deal with these folks? We are trying to hang on to our identity and carve it out. And so there was at the highest level of the state at the time, you saw Macedonia more quickly than some of the other countries adopt a kind of controlling and not wanting to deal with these refugees. At the same time, there were NGOs, including Macedonian NGOs, very active in extending humanitarian assistance to them. So I think Greece and Macedonia, in some sense, were, I mean, the citizens, I think, of both Greece and Macedonia were in a similarly divided as in most countries about whether this is, what your view is on your country being open to people who are in desperate need. Just as in the US, this is a dividing line. I don't actually know how well the two countries coordinated efforts. I do know that Gevgelia, again, was a major transit point where my sense was, Borchek can probably fill in, or anyone who was in Macedonia at the time, my sense was that the Macedonian authorities tried to be as humane as possible, but worked on the assumption that people didn't really want to end up in Macedonia, and so tried to sort of move them through as swiftly as possible, rather than necessarily sending them back. Danny has his hand up.
Yep, just one quick comment. And when I think about the Greek-Macedonian dispute versus the Bulgarian-Macedonian dispute, as Keith said, the Greek-Macedonian one focuses on Alexander the Great and ancient Macedonians and contest over that part of history, whereas the Bulgarian-Macedonian conflict focuses more on the early 20th century. And in my reading, and I'd welcome correction on this, somebody like Goțedelchev is key. And in my reading about Goțedelchev, it seems that he did refer to himself as a Bulgarian. And whether he referred to himself as a Macedonian is interesting, and whether that use of Macedonian means a national identity opposed to Bulgarian, or whether it means a geographical identity within the category Bulgarian is an open question that would be difficult to resolve. And for people interested in the issue, I'd recommend Catherine Verdery's book, Political Lives of Dead Bodies, which is a perfect one to understand what happened to Goțedelchev, since he died in what is now Greece, and then his body was removed to Sofia in Bulgaria, and then later was removed to Skopje in the Republic of Macedonia. And that illustrates the way states compete over the remains of ancestors to try to claim the link to these famous ancestors as part of nationalist history.
Borja, since Keith asked, do you have anything on that in terms of, I mean, I guess there may have been other people here who were in Macedonia during the refugee crisis, but we'll point you as the representative for any insights you might have on that.
Well, to be honest, I have a friend who used to work there, not in an NGO, but he was like in some, I'm not sure about the name, especially not how to translate it into English. It's some governmental organization. But I do not want to make this kind of comparison. How was it on the Greek side and how was it on the Macedonian side? As far as I know, a lot of people see profit in this situation, which is really sad, and I think that was like more or less the same on both sides, to be honest. So I don't have the calculation or the numbers regarding like this this situation, but as far as I know, we were trying to do this situation more bearable, especially knowing the fact that most of the refugees were actually just passing through our country and not like planning to stay there. So maybe that was also like easier in a way for everyone like in the country, and especially like the politicians.
Okay, thanks very much, Borja. And again, I would encourage people who want to be in touch to exchange contact information in the chat. You know, if you want to exchange privately, you can certainly do that in the chat. We won't download it and use it against you or to contact you. You know, Keith was mentioning how much expertise we have in this very capacious Zoom room of ours. And I did get a message from our colleague Kirill Hristovsky, who says that according to Igor Yanev, who's professor of international law from the University of Belgrade, any party in the Prespa agreement can withdraw from the agreement. Also, there's no mechanism for NATO to kick out Macedonia, even if the name was changed. Consequences, however, are a different issue. Okay, Sarah, sorry about that. I didn't realize that the chat was closed to private conversations except for the hosts. And I allow participants, that's a new one for me. I did not know that that was even a setting, so my apologies. But if there are people that you want to reach out to who were at this meeting, I am happy on behalf of CLI and the Melikian Center to be that person who's connecting them, even if you weren't able to privately chat them. So I did not even know that was a feature of the way this room was set up, but we'll look to address that in the future. Okay, so once again, a huge thank you to Dr. Danforth and Dr. Brown for sharing their knowledge and their experience and their you know, thoughts on this ongoing situation with us. I learned a great deal. I know that, again, that anytime we have these conversations, it's wonderful to hear from a multiplicity of voices. So I hope that we can, you know, soon have them in person again, and you can hear from people other than me. But it's still wonderful that some, you know, our colleagues who may not have normally been able to join us in Tempe at this time were able to join us today. So I want to thank everyone for coming out and for being participants in this great event.